The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. Last week, I fielded a question about what do I do when I don't feel as though I'm knowledgeable enough about an issue to form an opinion. And my response was basically, I say I'm not knowledgeable enough to really have a relevant opinion to contribute, but then I go and I try to learn about it. And along those lines, I have an interesting story today regarding the military escalation between India and Pakistan, which many people in the U.S., including myself, have not been following particularly closely, but I want to talk about it a little bit. And in particular, the sort of spinning of narratives around it, because there are similarities and differences with how a lot of these PR sort of battles end up going down in the United States. So the actual military escalation between India and Pakistan seems to be sort of winding down. On Friday, Islamabad handed over an Indian pilot whose plane the Pakistan Air Force had shot down just 2 days prior. India declared that it wants to maintain peace and stability in the region. They said they are not planning any more air operations into Pakistani territory. And then there has been a crossfire on what's called the line of control that divides India from Pakistan-administered Kashmir. That also has been settling down. If you don't know much about what's going on in the line of control, pull up Google Maps, okay, and look at the border between India and the Kashmir region, and you will see almost like puzzle pieces cut out, every single one of which has some kind of local territorial dispute connected to how these little bits of the border end up, or little bits of land end up flipping from being on one side of the border to the other. I mean, it's a really interesting conflict, and interesting makes us sound disconnected from the fact that a lot of people are suffering in this conflict. I don't want to make that seem like it is unimportant, but it is an extraordinarily interesting thing to look at. Now, is this going to be a temporary sort of calming down? It's unclear. There's a very tense situation after there was a suicide bombing on February 14th in Pulwama, India, which was claimed by a Pakistani-based extremist group designated actually as a terrorist group by the UN called Jaish-e-Muhammad. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who is in the middle of a difficult re-election campaign, is using this as an opportunity to foment his strongman image. We know that Tulsi Gabbard, Democratic presidential candidate, has been very much favorable to Modi, and that's another sort of data point of connection to American politics here. And now it's becoming basically a propaganda war. In this lull of actual military escalation, it is a full-out propaganda war. And similarly to how it goes on in the United States, you see this hyper-partisan, I guess what we would call people talking past each other, where the two narratives that are being spun often don't even engage with the opposing narratives. They sort of want to put out a story in a vacuum or in total isolation from the fact that there are disagreements. That's an example of like what Fox News will often do. They will sometimes take certain stories where they're clearly just wrong on the facts. They won't even acknowledge that there's another perspective, and they just kind of go full steam ahead like this is the only possible point of view. And it works. It leads to viewers of Fox News who have no idea that much of what Fox News is reporting is not only wrong, but also heavily disputed as a topic of conversation on other media outlets. On the other hand, you have these hyper-partisan bickering matches that are taking place in the weaving of this PR narrative involving India and Pakistan, which I guess I would say are more reminiscent of the type of, I hate to use the term discourse because it's not really discourse, but of the type of discourse that exists in social media in the United States around politics, this kind of completely unproductive nonsense. So if you are curious about Indian politics, particularly now that it's been mentioned a few times, connected to Tulsi Gabbard, check out a lot of the reporting about this conflict, this flare-up that goes back now about 2.5 to 3 weeks, longer, of course, in the bigger picture, but this micro flare-up to the middle of February. And if it's interesting to people for us to talk about some of these conflicts that are taking place in different parts of the world that we don't often get to on the regular show, I'm glad to keep talking about it and discussing with you. News from space exploration. There's an ancient system of lakes that has been identified underneath the surface of Mars. This is, every time that there's some kind of notable news from Mars, you have some percentage of people who say, this could mean life on Mars. And that is similarly happening with this discovery. This hints at the possibility that at some point a long time ago, there may have been some form of life on Mars. No one is questioning that right now it's a dry, desolate planet, but there is a growing body of evidence that at a certain point in time, there were significant bodies of water on Mars and also below the Martian surface, and that hints at the possibility that it would be a place where at least conceivably there could be some very simple forms of life. Is this some massive discovery? No, it's not. And I feel like, my excitement for space exploration is very deliberately tempered by me trying never to be hyperbolic in terms of news about Mars or other space exploration. I do think that there is a tendency, particularly when non-scientist journalists like myself are summarizing the importance of scientific findings. We see this with, quote, possible cancer cures. We see this with, quote, possible extraterrestrial life. It's very exciting. And that combined with the sometimes inaccessible way in which scientists sometimes will write research papers, it leads to conclusions that are not really reflecting reality. So I think here it's important to say this is not evidence of life on Mars now. It's not evidence that any particular form of life definitively existed on Mars at any period in time prior to now. It's evidence that if we expected to see simple forms of life that lived in bodies of water, the large bodies of water that we now can say with some certainty at some point existed on Mars would potentially be places where such simple life could exist, period. Will we learn more about it? Will we find out more? I hope so. That's what we can say for the time being. I want to follow up a little bit about tariffs. I don't want to sort of like rehash everything that we've talked about regarding trade policy, how tariffs work, that tariffs on China are actually paid by American companies when they import and purchase Chinese goods. We've talked about the sort of intractability, the impasse, or the lack of an off-ramp that there is with Donald Trump's trade policy. And we've talked about escalating tariffs. So there is a new set of tariffs that were set to go into force earlier in 2019, were more recently set to go into force on March 1st. And Donald Trump has continued to say, we're negotiating. It might be possible to delay or even avoid altogether going into this next set of escalated tariffs. And the latest report from the New York Times is that the Trump administration is very close to a deal with China, which would roll back some of the tariffs on both sides, but it would not really make any of those substantive changes to China's economy that Donald Trump wanted to make. So it's really important to remember this. Donald Trump's focus on trade has not been the same in every part of the world. With NAFTA, Canada, Mexico, the North American Free Trade Agreement, it has mostly been around issues of wage requirements, source material designations, and it being unfair in practice to American companies. These are Trump's claims. With China, there's been the added element of the theft of intellectual property, and that is not going to be resolved by the deal that potentially is close to a done deal. It would roll back some of the tariffs, but there would be nothing that would deal with the theft of intellectual property that Donald Trump claims to be extraordinarily concerned about. And you might remember that China has been issuing retaliatory tariffs against those instituted by President Trump, about $200 to $250 billion worth of Chinese imports subject to American levies, and China finding and sort of piecing together roughly equivalent amounts of tariffs. If those are rolled back, that is not going to change anything related to intellectual property, but there are some agreements related to agriculture and farming that Donald Trump seems to be close to negotiating. So this is really, I mean, we could do an economic analysis, and we've done it many times on the regular show. What I'm more interested in discussing here is that this is narrative spinning, okay? Donald Trump is going to be able to, maybe successfully, at least to his base, say, I put tariffs in place to get China to negotiate with us seriously, and they did, so now we can remove the tariffs. This is an extraordinarily dishonest or a naive or ignorant point of view. Donald Trump put in tariffs in order to fix the trade imbalance and to deal with Chinese theft of American intellectual property. The trade imbalance has skyrocketed since the tariffs were put in place. And if these rollbacks take place, number one, you're not fixing the trade imbalance. You might just bring it back to the levels from the beginning of Trump's presidency, which he claimed were unacceptable to begin with. And you do nothing about intellectual property. But the narrative is going to be, and it will probably work on voters, sadly, I put the tariffs on, we negotiated, and now I'm ready to remove the tariffs. But the negotiations themselves were only about the tariffs, not the underlying issues. It's sort of like if you are in a business negotiation with a business partner, and the dispute is that you feel that the business partner is not allowing you to collect a fair salary. So you say, you know what? I am going to destroy or I'm going to disable company vehicles because I want to fix this issue of me not being paid a fair salary. So you disable the company vehicles. Eventually, your business partner comes in and negotiates with you, and you negotiate only about the re-enabling of the company vehicles. You don't do anything about the fact that you don't feel you're being compensated fairly. The vehicles are re-enabled, and you say you won because you disabled the vehicles, you had a negotiation, and now the vehicles are enabled again. The whole point of the thing was to renegotiate your salary, which you've not done. That's the underlying issue. And that's effectively what Donald Trump is doing here. But sadly, helped, of course, by Sean Hannity and Fox News and the right-wing propaganda machine, Trump is going to be able to say, the tariffs worked, we negotiated, and the tariffs are now gone, even though the underlying issues Trump claimed to want to fix will still be there. Let me know if you agree that this is going to be successfully spun by Trump into a victory. We will absolutely follow up if and when this deal is made a reality. And there's no question we'll continue talking about Donald Trump's trade and economic policy as we continue on the program this week and next week. Welcome to all of our new members under the 60 for 60 promotion. We reached 600,000 subscribers on YouTube over the weekend. So we offered 60 memberships at a 60% discount. Very, very exciting. Most of them spoken for. So welcome to nearly 60 new members since yesterday. I'm glad you're here. I hope you will be here for a while. And I genuinely and truly appreciate your support.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.